The wind came down from the mountains like something with teeth, carrying the first real snow of November across the Wyoming high country. Tom Bradley stood at the fence of Red Hollow Rescue Ranch, watching the newest arrival pace the corral with the restless energy of something that had never learned to be still. The Mustang was a gray, storm-colored, people called it, with a white blaze down his face and eyes that held the particular wildness of creatures who'd been born free and resented every moment of captivity. "His name's Ashwind," the hauler had said earlier that morning, unloading the horse with the wary movements of someone who'd been kicked before. 5 ranches in 8 months. Nobody can keep him. Too jumpy, too wild, dangerous, some say. Tom had signed the temporary housing agreement without reading it carefully, knowing he couldn't afford another mouth to feed, but unable to turn away an animal everyone else had given up on. Red Hollow was the last stop for horses nobody wanted. A struggling rescue operation held together by Tom's stubbornness and the memory of his late wife, who'd believed that broken things deserved second chances. Ashwind stopped pacing and turned to face Tom across the corral, his ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring to catch scent. Tom had worked with difficult horses for 30 years, but something about this Mustang felt different. Not mean or vicious, just alert, hyper-aware, like a soldier who'd seen too much combat and couldn't stop scanning for threats that might or might not exist. "You're not dangerous," Tom said quietly, though the horse was too far away to hear over the rising wind. "You're just waiting for something." The Mustang's gaze shifted past Tom, toward the tree line that marked the boundary between the ranch and the national forest beyond. He stared at those trees with an intensity that made Tom turn and look too, though he saw nothing except pines bending under the weight of gathering snow. Ashwind had been staring at that tree line for 3 days now, ever since he'd arrived, waiting, watching, as if something out there was calling to him in a language only wild things could understand. In the town of Clearwater Falls, 12 miles down the mountain from Red Hollow, Ellen Porter sat in her daughter's kitchen and tried to remember where she was. The disease had been stealing pieces of her mind for 2 years now, small things at first, then larger ones, until whole days disappeared into fog she couldn't penetrate. She was 76 and most of the time didn't recognize her own reflection. But sometimes, in the spaces between confusion, she remembered clarity with such sharpness it hurt. "Mom, you need to eat something." Her daughter Ruth set a bowl of soup on the table, her voice carrying the particular exhaustion of caregivers who'd learned that patience was measured in years rather than days. Ellen looked at the soup but couldn't remember what it was for. The spoon beside it seemed like a puzzle piece from a different puzzle entirely. Outside the window, snow had begun to fall, thick, heavy flakes that meant serious weather coming. Ellen watched it and felt something stir in the fog of her memory. Something important she needed to remember, someone she needed to find. "The horses," she said suddenly. "I need to check on the horses." Ruth's expression flickered with pain. "Mom, we don't have horses anymore. That was 20 years ago, remember? The farm's been gone since Dad died." But Ellen was already standing, already moving toward the door, with the determined confusion of someone following instincts older than memory. Ruth caught her arm gently but firmly, guiding her back to the chair, speaking in soothing tones that meant nothing and everything simultaneously. "It's okay, Mom. The horses are fine. You're safe here. Everything's okay." Ellen sat because her body obeyed even when her mind wandered, but she kept staring out at the falling snow, trying to grasp the thought that kept slipping away like water through her fingers. Horses, mountains, something gray with kind eyes that had let her touch its face when she'd visited that ranch in the fall. What was its name? Where had it gone? The memory dissolved before she could hold it. The blizzard warning came through Tom's radio that evening, while he was feeding the rescue horses their dinner rations. The Weather Service was calling it a once-in-a-decade storm, temperatures dropping to 10 below zero, wind gusts up to 60 miles per hour, visibility near zero. They were advising everyone to shelter in place, stock up on supplies, and prepare for power outages that might last days. Tom finished his rounds and returned to the small ranch house he'd shared with his wife before cancer took her 3 years ago. The rooms felt too big and too empty, filled with silence that no amount of radio noise could quite cover. He ate dinner standing at the counter, watching through the window as the storm intensified, turning the world into a swirling chaos of white. Ashwind stood in his corral, facing into the wind, his mane whipping like a flag. Tom had offered him shelter in the barn, but the Mustang had refused, choosing to stand exposed to the elements like he was guarding something, or waiting for something. Tom pulled on his heaviest coat and trudged back out through the deepening snow to check on the horses one final time before the storm made movement impossible. All of them had retreated to their stalls except Ashwind, who still stood at the fence, his gray coat already dusted white, his dark eyes fixed on the tree line that had disappeared into the blizzard's fury. "Come on, horse," Tom called over the wind's howl. "Whatever you're waiting for isn't coming tonight." But Ashwind didn't move, just stood there like a sentinel, muscles tense beneath snow-covered hide, ears swiveling to catch sounds Tom's human ears couldn't detect. And for just a moment, Tom felt it too, a pull, toward the mountains, a sense that something out there needed finding, needed help, needed the kind of rescue that had nothing to do with fences or safety or common sense. He shook off the feeling and returned to the house, but it stayed with him through the long night while the storm raged and Ashwind stood watch in the corral, never sleeping, never resting, just waiting for whatever signal only he could hear. In Clearwater Falls, Ellen woke at 2 a.m. to a house gone silent, except for the wind. Ruth had finally fallen into exhausted sleep upstairs, trusting that her mother was secure behind a locked bedroom door. But Ellen's hands remembered how to work a lock, even when her mind didn't remember why she shouldn't. She stood in her nightgown and slippers, looking out at a world transformed by snow, and heard a voice calling to her. Not words exactly, but a feeling, a certainty that someone needed her, that she had to go, had to walk into the white darkness and find whatever was waiting out there in the cold. She pulled on the coat hanging by the door, stepped out into the blizzard, and let the storm swallow her like the fog that lived in her mind, complete and absolute and beyond all reaching. By the time Ruth woke at dawn and found her mother's room empty, Ellen had been walking for hours through the killing cold, her mind somewhere between the present and a past, where she still knew how to find her way home. The search would begin soon. The race against time had already started, and in his corral at Red Hollow, Ashwind began to pace with increased agitation, his breath coming in visible clouds, his hooves striking the frozen ground with rhythmic insistence, a war drum calling him to battle, a heartbeat measuring time running out. Tom woke to a silence that felt wrong. The blizzard had passed in the night, leaving behind a world buried under 3 feet of fresh snow and a cold so brutal it turned breath to ice crystals. He pulled on layers and stepped outside to find the ranch transformed into a landscape of white drifts and crystalline beauty that would kill you if you stayed exposed too long. The horses were fine, all bedded down in their stalls, protected from the worst of the storm's fury. But when Tom reached Ashwind's corral, his stomach dropped. The gate hung open, swinging slowly in the light breeze. The latch had been shattered from the inside, the metal bent and twisted by force that spoke of desperation rather than panic. And leading away from the corral, clear in the fresh snow, were tracks, hoofprints heading straight toward the mountains, toward the national forest, where the terrain grew rough and the cold killed quickly. "Damn it," Tom breathed, his mind already calculating how far a frightened horse could run in a night, how long before hypothermia set in, how impossible it would be to find one gray Mustang in a landscape that had turned entirely gray and white. He was pulling out his phone to call the county sheriff when the radio in his barn crackled to life with an emergency broadcast. A woman was missing in Clearwater Falls. Ellen Porter, age 76, suffering from Alzheimer's. She'd wandered from her home sometime during the storm. Search and rescue teams were mobilizing, but the conditions were brutal. Visibility was poor, and time was critical. Tom stared at the radio, then at the tracks leading from Ashwind's corral, and felt something click into place in his mind. A pattern he couldn't quite see but could sense the shape of, like touching objects in darkness. He wasn't running away, Tom said aloud to the empty barn. He was running towards something. The rationale part of his brain said it was impossible. Horses didn't break out of corrals to rescue missing people, but Tom had learned over 30 years of working with animals that what seemed impossible often just meant you didn't understand the language being spoken. He loaded supplies into his truck, emergency blankets, rope, first aid kit, flares, and followed Ashwind's tracks as far as the vehicle could manage before the terrain and snow made further driving suicide. Then he continued on foot, following hoofprints that led steadily upward into the high country, where the cold was a living thing that wrapped around you and squeezed. 2 hours in, the tracks disappeared, buried under fresh drifts or blown away by wind that had scoured the exposed ridgelines. Tom stood on a slope that overlooked miles of forest and felt the particular helplessness of knowing someone needed saving and having no idea where to begin looking. He radioed the search and rescue coordinator, a gruff man named Daniel, who'd known Tom since childhood. "I've got tracks from a Mustang that broke out of Red Hollow last night," Tom explained. "Headed northeast toward the national forest. I lost the trail on the north ridge." Static crackled. Then Daniel's voice came back flat with exhaustion. "Tom, we've got a missing woman with Alzheimer's out here somewhere. We don't have resources to chase down a spooked horse. He's probably dead by now anyway, or so deep in the backcountry we'll never find him. I'm sorry, but we have to focus on Ellen Porter." "What if they're connected?" Tom asked, knowing how it sounded, but unable to shake the conviction that had been growing since he'd seen that broken gate. What if the horse was tracking her? The silence that followed was long enough that Tom thought he'd lost the connection. Then Daniel's voice came back, careful and kind. "Tom, I know you love that wife of yours, and I know losing her made you see meaning where sometimes there's just random tragedy. But horses don't track people through blizzards. They run to survive, not to rescue. Come back down. Let us handle this. Go home and mourn your Mustang if you want, but don't make this into something it's not." Tom ended the call and stood in the brutal cold, torn between reason and instinct. Then he thought about his wife's voice in his final weeks. "The biggest mistakes we make are the times we ignore what we know to be true because other people say it's impossible." He kept climbing. Out in the wilderness that had no name and allowed no mercy, Ashwind pushed through snow that reached his chest, his breath coming in clouds that froze before they could dissipate. He'd been moving for 8 hours straight, following a scent trail that was more memory than smell, the particular signature of the human who touched his face with gentle hands back in October, when the world was still warm and his life had been nothing but a series of rejections from ranches that didn't want him. Ellen Porter. He didn't know her name, but he knew her presence, the way she'd looked at him, not with the calculation of someone assessing value or the fear of someone expecting violence, but with simple recognition, one lost thing acknowledging another. That moment of connection had planted something in Ashwind's wild heart, some awareness that this particular human mattered in ways he couldn't name but could feel. When her scent had come to him on the storm, winds the night before, carried across 12 miles of mountains by weather systems that made nonsense of distance and direction, Ashwind had recognized it immediately. And when that scent had turned desperate, mixed with the chemical signature of fear and confusion and a body shutting down from cold, the Mustang had done what wild things did when survival depended on action rather than thought. He'd broken free and run toward what needed finding. Now, as the sun climbed toward its weak winter apex, Ashwind crested a ridge and caught the scent strong and immediate. Below, in a hollow protected from the worst of the wind, a dark shape lay half buried in snow. The Mustang descended carefully, his hooves finding purchase on ice-covered rocks, until he stood beside Ellen Porter's motionless form. She was alive. Barely. Her lips had gone blue, and her breathing was so shallow it barely moved her chest. But she was alive, and Ashwind understood with the perfect clarity of instinct that she would not stay alive unless he acted. He circled her twice, his hooves compacting the snow, creating a barrier against the wind. Then he lowered himself carefully to the ground beside her, something Mustangs rarely did in the wild, a vulnerable position that meant trust or desperation, and pressed his body against hers, sharing the warmth that still lived in his muscles and blood. Snow began to fall again, lighter than the night before, but persistent. It accumulated on Ashwind's back, on his mane, on the edges of his folded legs. But he didn't move, didn't rise, just lay there like a living shelter, while Ellen's body borrowed his heat and clung to life by the thinnest of margins. Hours passed, the cold deepened, and Ashwind stayed, his dark eyes fixed on the tree line, waiting for help he had no reason to believe would come, but choosing to hope. Anyway, because hope was all that separated survival from surrender. Somewhere in the distance, search helicopters circled, their rotors beating against thin air, their crews scanning thousands of acres of identical white landscape for a single human lost in infinite emptiness. And in that hollow, beyond their searching, beyond their scanning, beyond the reach of their technology and training, a wild Mustang named Ashwind stood guard over a woman he barely knew, proving that some connections transcended reason and some rescues required nothing more than the stubborn refusal to abandon those who needed saving. The snow continued to fall, the temperature continued to drop, and Ashwind continued to wait, his breath forming clouds that mixed with Ellen's faint exhalations, two lives keeping each other warm in a world that had turned cold enough to kill. Dawn came to the Wyoming high country like a held breath releasing, slow and quiet and almost too gentle for the violence of what had come before. The storm had passed completely now, leaving behind crystalline air so clear you could see for miles. And in that clarity, the search and rescue helicopter pilot spotted something that made her radio back to base with controlled urgency. "I've got a visual on something dark in Sector 7, she said, banking the helicopter for another pass. "Could be a downed tree or... Wait, it's moving. Definitely not a tree." Through the helicopter's powerful camera, the shape resolved into impossible detail. A gray horse, covered in snow and ice, standing over what appeared to be a human form. The horse's head was up, alert, tracking the helicopter's approach, but he didn't move from his position, just stood there like a statue carved from storm and stubbornness, refusing to abandon his post. "Contact ground team," the pilot said, her voice tight with something between disbelief and wonder. "I think we found her, and she's not alone." Tom had made it another 3 miles up the mountain when his radio crackled with Daniel's voice. Different now, urgent and disbelieving in equal measure. "Tom, where are you?" "North Ridge. Why?" "Because you were right. Helicopter found your Mustang. He's with Ellen Porter. Get your GPS coordinates to me now. We're sending the ground team to your location." 20 minutes later, Tom crested the final rise and looked down into the hollow where Ashwind stood like a guardian carved from ice. The Mustang's gray coat was encrusted with frozen snow. His mane hung in icicles, and his legs trembled with exhaustion that must have been beyond anything he'd ever endured. But his eyes were clear and watchful, and when he saw Tom approaching, he didn't bolt or shy away, just stood there, waiting for help to arrive in whatever form it chose to take. Ellen Porter lay curled in the snow beside where Ashwind had been lying, her face pale as death, but her chest still rising and falling with breath that shouldn't have been possible after a night. Exposed to temperatures that killed within hours. The rescue team arrived moments later, trained professionals with equipment and protocols, and the practiced efficiency of people who had done this before. They wrapped Ellen in warming blankets, checking her vitals, preparing her for transport, calling out medical terms that Tom didn't fully understand, but recognized as meaning she was alive, she was stable, she had somehow survived the impossible. "Body temperature is 89 degrees, one of the medics said, surprise evident in his voice. "That's hypothermic but not critical. By all rights, she should be dead. What kept her this warm?" The answer stood 10 feet away, shaking with exhaustion, his back covered in ice, his legs barely supporting his weight. Ashwind had given Ellen Porter his body heat through the coldest night in a decade, had lain beside her for hours while his own core temperature dropped dangerously low, had chosen her survival over his comfort or safety. Tom approached the Mustang slowly, hands visible and non-threatening, speaking in the low voice he'd used with frightened horses his entire life. "Easy, boy, it's over. You did it. She's going to make it because of you." Ashwind's eyes found Tom's, and in them, Tom saw exhaustion beyond measure, but also something that looked almost like relief. The Mustang took one step forward, then his legs buckled, and he went down in the snow, collapsing from the effort that had sustained him through the night, but couldn't carry him another moment. The rescue team worked quickly, warming blankets for the horse as well as the woman, hot packs, fluids, everything they could do in the field before the helicopter could transport Ellen to the hospital. Dr. Rebecca Hayes, the veterinarian who volunteered with search and rescue, examined Ashwind with hands that were gentle but efficient. "Severe exhaustion," she said quietly to Tom. "Hypothermia, dehydration, but nothing that can't heal with proper care. This horse should be dead, Tom. The fact that he's not is... I don't have words for it. I don't know how he made it this far, how he found her, or how he kept her alive, but he did all 3 things that should have been impossible. They got Ashwind on his feet eventually, supporting him on both sides as they walked him slowly down the mountain toward the ranch truck that had managed to navigate the logging roads to within a mile of the rescue site. The Mustang moved like a creature moving through a dream, one step at a time, powered by nothing but the stubborn determination that had brought him this far. Ellen was airlifted to the hospital in Clearwater Falls, where her daughter Ruth wept and clutched the hand of a mother who'd somehow been given back to her against all probability. The doctors said she'd recover fully with no permanent damage, frostbite on her fingers and toes, nothing worse. A miracle, they called it, though they had no explanation for how an elderly woman with Alzheimer's had survived exposure that should have killed her in the first hour. The town learned the story within hours, and by evening, everyone in Clearwater Falls and the surrounding valleys knew about the wild Mustang that 5 ranches had rejected, the horse nobody could keep, the dangerous animal that had turned out to be the most heroic creature any of them had ever encountered. They came to Red Hollow in the days that followed, reporters with cameras, families with children who wanted to see the hero horse, officials from rescue organizations offering awards and recognition. Tom turned most of them away, protecting Ashwind's recovery, giving the Mustang space to heal in peace. Ruth Porter came a week later, after her mother had been released from the hospital and was recovering at home. She stood at the fence of Ashwind's corral, tears streaming down her face, trying to find words adequate to the gratitude she felt. "My mother's alive because of him," she finally managed. "Everything I have, my mom's laugh, her stories, the chance to say goodbye properly when the time comes, all of it exists because this horse did something impossible. We want to keep him, want to give him a home where he'll never be rejected again, where he'll be cared for and honored and—" "He doesn't want to be kept," Tom interrupted gently. "I've been watching him this week. He's healing, getting his strength back, but he's not settling. He's still looking at those mountains like they're calling him home. But we owe him everything. You do. And the way you pay that debt is by giving him what he actually wants rather than what you think he deserves." Tom looked at Ashwind, who stood at the far end of the corral, his gray coat shining again, his strength returning day by day. "He's a wild thing. Saving your mother didn't make him tame. It just proved that wild things can be heroic and that freedom and connection aren't opposites." 2 weeks after the rescue, when Ashwind had fully recovered and the weather had turned mild enough for safe travel, Tom organized what he simply called the release. The town came, not the whole town, but enough people to line the road leading from Red Hollow to the national forest boundary. Standing in respectful silence as Tom led Ashwind down the path he'd followed the night of the blizzard, Ellen Porter was there, supported by Ruth, her mind clear enough today to understand what was happening, even if tomorrow she might not remember. When they reached the forest edge and Tom removed Ashwind's lead rope, Ellen took a step forward and placed her hand on the Mustang's face the way she'd done that October day, when neither of them had known their connection would lead to salvation. "Thank you," she said simply, and Ashwind pressed into her touch one final time before stepping away. Tom opened the gate that marked the boundary between managed land and wilderness, and Ashwind walked through it without hesitation, without looking back, knowing with the certainty of wild things that this was right, that this was home. That some stories ended not with captivity, but with freedom earned through courage. The Mustang moved through the snow-covered meadow beyond the gate, his gray coat making him almost invisible against the winter landscape. But just before he reached the tree line, he stopped and turned, his dark eyes finding the gathered humans one last time. Tom felt the weight of that gaze. Recognition, perhaps, or acknowledgement that their lives had intersected in ways that mattered. That the rejected Mustang and the struggling rancher and the confused woman had formed a constellation that had saved all of them in different ways. Then Ashwind turned back toward the mountains and disappeared into the trees, becoming part of the wild country he'd always belonged to, leaving behind only tracks in the snow and a story that would be told for generations in the valleys below. The crowd dispersed slowly, returning to trucks and homes and lives that had been touched by something larger than themselves. Tom stood at the gate until the sun began its descent, watching the tree line where Ashwind had vanished, feeling the particular satisfaction of having done the right thing, even when it cost something to do it. Ruth approached with Ellen, the older woman's hand in her daughter's, her eyes clearer than they had been in weeks. "Will he be okay out there?" Ruth asked. Tom nodded. "He was born out there, lived most of his life out there. The ranches were the mistake, not the wilderness. Now he's where he belongs. And if he needs help again, he knows where to find it. Tom looked at Red Hollow, at the ranch that had become a haven for rejected things, at the life he'd built from loss and loneliness, and the stubborn belief that broken things deserve second chances. They always know where to find it. Ellen spoke suddenly, her voice soft but certain. He wasn't just any horse. He was waiting. All those ranches rejected him because he knew he had something more important to do. You can't keep a creature that's already claimed by purpose. The wisdom of that statement, whether it came from Ellen's lucid moments or from some deeper place the disease hadn't touched, settled over Tom like benediction. Ashwind had been waiting, for what Tom might never fully understand. But the Mustang had known, with the knowing that existed beyond human comprehension, that his purpose wasn't to be owned or tamed or made useful by human standards. His purpose had been to save a life when no one else could have, and then to return to the wild, where purpose and freedom were the same thing. As darkness settled over the Wyoming high country, Tom imagined Ashwind moving through the forest, finding his herd, or claiming his territory, or simply existing in the way wild things existed, present and alive and answerable to nothing except the ancient rhythms that governed mountain and wind and snow. The Mustang, who'd been rejected by every ranch, had found the one thing that mattered more than acceptance. A moment when his wildness was exactly what the world needed, when his refusal to be tamed became the key to survival, when being broken to no one's service meant being free to serve the only cause that truly mattered: life, connection. The stubborn insistence that some bonds transcended reason and some rescues required nothing more complicated than showing up when needed and refusing to abandon those who needed saving. Tom turned from the gate and walked back to Red Hollow, leaving the wilderness to its mysteries and the wild horse to his freedom, carrying with him the certainty that every rejection Ashwind had endured had been necessary to bring him to that moment in the blizzard when a confused woman and a wild horse had needed each other in ways that would resonate long after both their lives had passed. And in the mountains above, Ashwind ran beneath stars that wheeled overhead in patterns older than naming, his hooves drumming against frozen earth in rhythms that spoke of survival and sacrifice, and the particular grace that came from choosing connection over safety, from breaking free not to run away, but to run toward what needed finding. The guardian had returned to his mountains. The hero had gone home. And the story, the impossible, beautiful story, would live on in the telling, proof that wildness and love were not opposites, that rejection and purpose could walk hand in hand, and that sometimes the most heroic thing you could do was simply refuse to stop caring when everyone else had given up.